Have you ever been confused by the NHS pension and not felt you know where you are with it? It's estimated that over 18,000 GPs in England have missing pension records. That's nearly 60% of the GP population. And together, up until 22-23, that would result in 156,000 years of missing pension data. My name's Katie Collin. Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet. In this podcast episode, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Graham Crossley, who is the founder of Medifintech and an NHS pension specialist. So, Graham, thank you so much for joining me today on this episode. I know it's a hot topic, NHS pensions. So it'd be great just to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about what you do.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm always keen to talk about NHS pensions, as you well know. My role at Medifintech is that we provide specialist NHS pension support for financial advisors, for accountants, and for members directly, but very much sort of don't stop there, very much involved in lobbying government for change to improve the situation for members, as well as challenging NHS BSA on areas that where there are wrongs that need righting. And there have been a litany of errors over the years that we have been involved with resolving. And fortunately, we are in a position, I think, whereby government are actually starting to listen and slowly trying to improve things. I'm not saying that the current state of affairs is great, because it's far from it, as you alluded to there, on the amount of missing pension records. That is the tip of the iceberg as far as problems with NHS pensions go. So yeah, talk all day on those.
We could. So, I mean, just before we get started talking about it, how did you actually get into dealing with the NHS pension? How did you end up focusing on that?
Well, so my background is I was a chartered financial planner, and I specialised in working with GPs. And back in 2010-11, from memory, we started having problems with the reduction of lifetime allowance. And that started to bring about behaviours in GPs who started to retire earlier than they ordinarily would have. And so that started sounding some sort of alarm bell. So I kind of started building some pension models back then to try and give people comfort, knowing that despite taxation, the benefits would still outweigh the costs, and they didn't have to sort of knee-jerk retiring out of a profession that they really cared for when they didn't actually want to leave. They thought that the tax was making them go that way. Then when we had the summer budget that was going to introduce the annual allowance taper, I instantly did all of the modelling for that, and big alarm bells, in that it was going to be way worse than lifetime allowance. I remember at the time writing to the BMA, writing to NHS BSA, Department of Health, anybody say, please have a look at this, because when this comes in, it will be an absolute disaster. I know the accountancy profession did exactly the same type of thing. They saw this coming as well, and they also wrote in. And because it felt like there weren't enough voices sort of standing up for NHS pension members, because the NHS pension scheme is ridiculously complicated, and then you overlay tax is even more so. I then set up Medifintech to provide that type of specialist analysis so that people can be informed of what their actual pension is. And then through that, we've been able to sort of identify many different types of errors and correct them. We've saved members millions of pounds now over the last 5-6 years, just correcting these errors. So that's where it all started. I think government's got things wrong, and no one knows enough about it. And I still don't think there's enough specialism within government or within the NHS pension framework to fully understand the nuances. And I think there's a lack of representation from the accountancy sector and the financial services sector when it comes to all of this.
Absolutely.
All of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, we see it as a huge issue for our clients, and I know it's an incredibly complex landscape. Why do you think it is so complicated with the NHS pension?
The trouble is you have a complex pension scheme. So the old final salary schemes and also the old practitioner scheme, the 9508 scheme, is a very complicated pension that's governed by a set of legislation, which itself runs to many pages. And when you then overlay the changes in tax policy, which didn't really understand NHS pensions, we had this catastrophic effect whereby those who probably weren't intended to be hit by these tax changes, such as the annual allowance, which is designed to try and stop sort of city fat cats hiving money off into personal pensions, they didn't realise that by using these different formulas to how to apply it to defined benefit pension, suddenly you'd get ordinary doctors earning not that much money, having to pay a massive amount of tax charges. We then had absurdities, for example, like the annual allowance taper, where you could have a doctor who might earn £1, and it could be £1 from a savings account that could trigger a
Oh
£13,500
no,
tax bill. How nonsense is
it's
that?
crazy.
So I think they have been sort of caught up in their own complexity, both in tax planning and also in pension regulations for those that govern the NHS pension. And I don't think they intended these consequences. If they did, absolute genius to try and work this all out in advance.
Well, and I think you mentioned sort of the tax changes, and we've seen that certainly in recent years, haven't we, of it becoming much more complicated, and we frequently see people opting out of the NHS pension because those tax changes have made it what people would say is unaffordable. And where there have been tax changes recently, also we noticed the cost of living going up, and of course it's a very expensive scheme to contribute to. So I think the biggest anxiety people feel generally is they feel it's inaccessible. They have no idea actually even where they stand with it in the first place to be able to make decisions about opting in
Mhm.
and out or what they've got. I mean, do you find that that's why people sort of end up talking to Medifintech?
Very much so. One of the key things that we do is that we actually analyse what somebody's pension is going to be up until their chosen date of retirement,
Mm,
factoring in any type of scenario that they wanted sort of to look at, whether or not as a GP they might want to reduce their sessions, they might want to retire early, they might want to retire late. We can work all of that out. Unfortunately, that type of resource isn't available from
mm,
their pension provider, which is in a way a bit of a shame that
mm.
that can't be provided, especially when you then also overlay the tax side of things. Because again, it would be unrealistic to expect NHS pensions to be able to do a full tax assessment for each individual GP as
Yeah.
part of their pension as part of their total reward statement. But it doesn't help the complexities of the administration that sort of sit in the background. You mentioned before about the number of GPs whose records aren't up
Mm,
to date. And this isn't a new problem. This has been a problem for years and years and years. And every time it means that people can't look at total reward statements. They don't know what the situation is. We look at, for example, the McCloud Remedy and the fact that people have to reassess annual allowance charges for 7 years. And we are now nearing the end of 2025, and they still haven't had the letters that they were meant to have got by October 2024.
no.
How are these people meant to make decisions?
No, and I think the pension report. I know that's something that we've worked with you in is really helpful just to give even an indication or an estimate of where do you think you sit. It's very different in a private scheme. You can kind of see what you've contributed, and I think people often don't know even what they're paying in isn't necessarily linked to what they're actually getting at the end because it's a defined benefit scheme. So there's a lot of confusion out there. I mean, you mentioned you saved people millions over the last few years, and I know we've seen cases of
Yes.
that as well. What sort of things have you seen where things go wrong?
So it depends on the type of client. So, for example, for those who are officer members, we saw some big issues with the application of the rules
Mm.
for calculating a member's benefits, which then led to incorrect pension growth being recorded and therefore very real tax charges off the back of that incorrect pension growth. So, for example, up until 2022, officer members, their pension growth was measured on last year's pensionable pay rather than the best of the last 3 years' pensionable pay.
Mm.
So if somebody's pay went down, then up again, you got charged twice for the same growth. We saw things, particularly, for example, for GPs, there was this issue of the sort of CPI disconnect, whereby the pension benefits that you accrued using the inflation rate from 1 year, whereas the opening value of pension benefits were uplifted by using the CPI from a different year. So we had
Mm.
this two different rates of inflation, which meant that in some years we saw GPs' pensions being taxed just because of inflation, which again is absurd. Thankfully, these things have been addressed. Some of
Mm.
them have been addressed, but we still see errors on a regular basis. We're currently challenging NHS BSA now on how they're calculating GP pension growth. We don't think it's accurate
No,
for some of the RPSSs.
it's crazy. And I suppose that's probably what feeds into the anxiety is when you eventually do get something on your pension. The question that a lot of people ask is how do I know this is right? And it is so complicated, even just some of the calculations you've just talked about. For most people, that probably feels quite overwhelming. What do all those things mean? They don't even know where to start in terms of checking, I've got this piece of paper saying I've got this pension.
Mhm.
How do I know those numbers are even correct? So presumably that's sort of the sort of thing that you would look at as well.
It is the type of thing that we do and the type of analysis that we conduct. However, anybody can do the first stuff themselves, the basics. So I would urge all members of the NHS pension to, if you're in England and Wales, that is, to get in touch with NHS BSA on 0300 3301 346. See, we know the number so well now. But you can ask for something called your O5 service extract, which is this brilliant document that actually sets out for every role that you've undertaken in the NHS that's been pensionable. It has the start date, the end date, how much pensionable pay you earned. If you're on a less than full-time contract, it shows you how many hours you worked, what the standard hours were, what your sessional hourly rate was. And so we've looked at some of those, for example, and you suddenly see that somebody earned £2 million a year. No, they didn't.
They'd be
That's
very lucky
obviously
if they
something that went
did, yeah.
very, very wrong. So there's a legion of different types of errors that can contribute to the numbers in that document being wrong. But the first port of call is to look at that document, compare it against your own CV and your own knowledge about your own career, and see, well, are there any gaps that shouldn't be there? Do any of these numbers look wrong? And then take it from there. And a lot of the times people can challenge this themselves. They can just simply go back to either their employer or PCSE and say, wait a minute, this isn't right. Can you fix it? And it does get fixed. But if you get stuck, well, that's where we can help.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I had an email over the weekend from a client saying that they had no records prior to 2004, which is something that I haven't seen that much. And it was employment. But it is interesting that there seems to be that disconnect in terms of how things actually kind of process through the system. And I suppose that's part of the fact that it's such a big organization. There's so many different things feeding in. But, that's just
True. And it
basic
doesn't help
errors.
that the GPs themselves, they don't know what they should be seeing. So we've had similar cases where there's been nothing on a pension record since the early noughties.
Yeah.
And we then built a whole model right from the beginning to sort of work out, well, this is actually what your pension is. They were just blindly assuming everything was fine because they were paying the pension contributions. They were all going in via their accountants and everything else like that. But nothing was hitting the record.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
Do you see, from your experience, a big difference between the officers and the practitioners in terms of the issues that they're experiencing?
Definitely. I think with the practitioners, there's significant issues regarding the record keeping, more so than you have with officers. But they both have issues with administration. I think with the officer side of things, if you think there are nearly 2 million members of the NHS pension scheme in total,
Wow.
and 1 million or so who are active. I don't know the exact numbers. So if you think about how many pension records are being administered on a daily basis by an administrator that might only look at this as a small part of their job role, them putting a number in a box, they don't know what the ramifications of that number are, and they might just inadvertently make an error. And there's going to be errors in that many records. But we are seeing definite problems with GP ones in particular.
Yeah. I mean, we obviously deal with that a lot. And
Mhm.
I think when you've got lots of different moving parts, so you've got NHS BSA processing the information, but of course it has to come through PCSE, and the way that PCSE have processed has changed. So originally people were sending certificates to PCTs, and then it went to PCSE, and now it's gone to PCSE online. There's lots of different, and we're seeing those regular issues,
Mhm.
and from our experience, and you probably see this as well, that people actually just feel so overwhelmed that things keep getting rejected or they don't get processed, they actually just give up.
Yeah.
And then therefore that compounds the issue. And I suppose for someone who is in that position, I know that's a lot of work that we do, looking at what's kind of missing and plugging the gap. From your experience, those things do get resolved eventually?
They do. And again, like you mentioned there, I encourage people to work very closely with their accountant on this to make sure that they have got the right certificates, that they have been submitted correctly and everything along those lines, because they do get resolved. I understand the frustration of trying to get them resolved. But it's the same way as when people see the big tax bills and opt out the pension scheme thinking, well, I'd rather just not worry about this. It's worth worrying about and it's worth trying to get it resolved. Otherwise, you're throwing away a significant part of your total reward. One of the big benefits of working in the NHS is the NHS pension scheme. It is specifically part of your total reward scheme. So if you are opting out of it or giving up on that membership, you're voluntarily sort of giving yourself a pay cut.
Yeah. And that's interesting because I think if people knew what kind of pension they'd be getting at the end, so, obviously we do the pension review report with you, and people are often very shocked when they get that and
Mm,
they say, oh, actually, if I retired at 60, I'd be getting a tax-free lump sum,
mhm.
assuming nothing changes in the budget, tax-free lump sum of X. And these are good pensions. I mean, it's expensive to contribute, as you say, but I think people don't necessarily have that visibility, and that's kind of what causes that sort of panic and opt-out. And from your experience with the tax, and obviously it's a case by case basis, do you think it's as bad as it looks when people see that tax bill? Do you think that the pension continues to grow more than sort of the tax they're paying?
It does. The issue you have is that it's trying to sort of compare a one-off tax bill for now
Mm,
against an ongoing income in retirement, which is a tricky thing to try and sort of balance.
of course.
But there are things that you can do. For example, you can use Scheme Pays, which is a scheme whereby the scheme can pay that debt on your behalf. Yes, it will accrue interest, and
Mm,
at retirement, it gets converted into a permanent deduction from your benefits. But if you look at how your pension increased, deduct that Scheme Pays deduction, you still have benefited far more than
mm,
the costs. So it's definitely
absolutely.
worth it.
Yeah. The other thing we see quite a lot is people, not so much now, but people hokey cokeying. I just love that expression as well. But people kind of coming out the scheme for a little bit to try and control their growth. I suppose benefits and disadvantages that you think of that?
Well, we saw a lot of people doing this, and it was at a time when the scheme was looking at different ways of controlling people's pensionable pay, whether or not
Mm,
you could sort of copy things like in other public sector schemes where you can have like 50% contributions for 50% costs,
mm,
etc. But unfortunately, that flexibility has never really been introduced within the scheme. So people have tried to sort of work out, well, if I was in for 6 months, then my pay would be this much. So if I divide that by 54 times by 16, I get that pension growth from over there. And then I do this. I'm just hoping that they've managed to not pension in as much to try and reduce the pension,
mm,
the pension growth, which again is a shame because if you get that wrong and if you're ill at the wrong time, then you also lose access to sort of very beneficial terms on ill health retirement, death in service, all of
yeah,
those types of things.
yeah.
So yeah, we've seen lots of people do hokey cokey, and in retrospect, probably not the right thing to have done.
No. And I think for GPs, it's hard as well because you're opting in and out in a time where you actually don't know how much you're earning. So because you're self-employed, effectively you have to wait till your accounts are done,
Yeah.
and then you're kind of looking backwards. And actually, if your profits are maybe higher than you were thinking because you couldn't recruit someone or you cut back on stuff and national insurance increases, things like that, then of course actually the growth's more than you think it's going to be because your profits are actually higher. And of course that then pushes you into a different tax bracket, and so it gets a lot more complicated, I think, to try and proactively plan. And maybe that's where people get frustrated.
They do. We always suggest that people should be in the scheme rather than out of the scheme.
Mm,
In all cases, mainly specifically for those family benefits that as well that you get alongside it. But
mm,
you're quite right. It's really hard for GPs, especially because they don't know what the pensionable pay is. All of these calculations, for most people, they don't actually see these figures until after the tax year has ended, so they can't actually do anything about it. And we have this absurd conversions of many different tax policies. So, for example, young consultants who are earning now just above £100,000 taxable, suddenly, well, they might actually have been better off putting a very small pension contribution in to get them
oh,
back below to
absolutely.
recover personal allowance, recover access to childcare,
Yeah.
etc.
Oh, yeah.
People who are subject to, again, the still daft annual allowance taper trap that we've got. I know it's much higher at 200,000,
Mm,
but it's still absurd that you can get a pound's worth of income for £22,500 tax. These are people that we are trying to incentivize to actually work to reduce waiting lists and everything else like that. Why bring about this sort of cloud of fears? Because they don't know what their tax bill is going to be. They don't know what the pension growth is within this tax year.
mm.
It's absurd, the current situation.
It is. And actually, the point about the tape is really interesting. So, we had a client who unfortunately lost her spouse and was in receipt of the widow pension, and that then took her over the taper threshold. So, ironically, it would have been better for her to stop working, having been receiving the spousal pensions.
Yeah.
So, it is, you're right. It actually is actively encouraging people to sort of change maybe the sessions they're doing,
Mhm.
reducing their income down. And that's not what we want. We obviously want to encourage people to be working. We want continuity of care. We want more more doctors.
We do. A healthier nation is a wealthier nation, and it's absurd that doctors who actually want to work are
Mm,
not working because of this fear of tax.
mm.
It really is absurd.
So there's been a lot happening in the pension world. A lot. I feel like there always is. But you mentioned earlier McCloud.
Yes.
Obviously, we've worked on McCloud together and we know about it. But probably for a lot of people watching this might not necessarily know that much in detail about McCloud or heard those words banded around. It'd just be helpful to get kind of a quick summary of, I suppose, what's happened, and then we can talk a bit about what you've seen from that process.
Okay, so in a very sort of brief nutshell, the government were found to have discriminated against younger pensioner members, and as a result of that, we have this McCloud Remedy, which has been sort of put into a couple of parts. One was to remove this transitional protection arrangement, and that happened back in April 2022, so that everybody is actually now part of the 2015 scheme. But the other part, which we're now starting to see happen, is this thing called the rollback. So all members who are subject to McCloud, so they had to be in the scheme as at March 2012, 31st March 2012, and also have some benefits within the remedy period between the 1st of April 2015 and the 1st of April 2022. All of those benefits that had originally moved to the 2015 scheme have now been rolled back to the old 9508
Mm,
scheme. So that in itself poses some interesting challenges. One, there are features in the new scheme that didn't exist in the old scheme, so they'll have some choices to make about those. But one of the big issues is this reassessment of pension tax,
mm,
because if you're in a different pension scheme for 7 years, then your pension growth is different, which means your tax charges were very different.
mm,
So we're going through this whole process whereby these remedial pension saving statements, or RPSSs, are being sent out with these old growth figures, new growth figures, and members have been told, right, over to you, work out the tax changes.
what
Which
could go
is
wrong?
well, absolutely nuts as well. We did put forward suggestions of how they could do this for everybody,
Mm,
just in a project between Department of Health, HMRC, but unfortunately that didn't get
no.
legs. But what we're then finding is lots and lots of members are due refunds and compensation for these, because the pension growth in just one pension scheme tends to be a little bit lower
Mm,
than having pension occurring in two schemes at the same time. And we saw some like average compensations around like £14,000 for this, but people aren't responding to these letters. So we know that when you look at sort of the tax take for years during the remedy period, about 65,000 or so members of the NHS pension had annual allowance tax charges. So those need to be kind of reassessed. Yes, there will be some people that aren't subject to this whole process, but they're going to be in the minority. Yet the recent Freedom of Information request from HMRC as to, well, who's actually done anything about this? Only about 14,000 members of the NHS pension have actually submitted any changes.
mm.
Now, I also get they are way, way behind in sending out
Oh,
these
yeah.
statements to members, but there's a lot of people who are going to potentially miss out on claiming compensation. Um, but there's support as well for these members. They've introduced this cost claim back scheme whereby if you get professional support, for example, like from yourselves or from
Mhm.
ourselves, then you can claim up to £1,000 via the cost claim back scheme to get this covered. So you you're not going to be out of pocket to do this type of analysis.
Yeah.
Admittedly, you're meant to do it within 12 months of receiving your RPSS, but
Mm,
again, that's something that we've challenged, and fortunately, NHS BSA are being very pragmatic about that at the
mm.
moment. So that's one half of McCloud. The other half, which unfortunately well, it's called the McCloud Choice, but you'll get a letter called a Remedial Service Statement, so an RSS. Can't believe they kept the names so close to confuse people even more. But this RSS will basically be the document that gives you your choice. Do you want your benefits in the old scheme for those 7 years, or do you want them in the new scheme for
Mm.
7 years? And again, there are significant delays. I think it's like 375,000 letters outstanding.
Oh, I can
And
imagine.
we're waiting for government to announce another set of deadlines for when those are going to be sent out.
Yeah.
It's quite embarrassing that they have missed the deadlines on that time and time again.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because obviously, I've been dealing with HMRC on this, and obviously we've worked together on this. And the concept was that all the statements would go out in October 24 and that this would all be wrapped up by January 25. And here we are at the end of 2025. And I mean, I think probably about 60% of our clients haven't had an
Yeah.
RPSS, something like that, that we know that they need to
Mm.
have one. And it is interesting you said to that point about people aren't doing anything about it. So I think there's sort of two cohorts. There's people who are getting a letter and think, oh, and don't really know how to deal with it. And then I think there's another cohort of people who probably know this is going to affect them and actually haven't had anything, haven't
Mm.
had any information. Obviously, those two very different brackets to see yourself in. And of course, it's all going out by post as well, isn't it?
I know.
So
Yeah.
in the age of technical development, we would expect to see something going out by email or something like that, but it's not. It's all going by post,
Yeah.
which is crazy because these things could
It
go
is.
missing.
We've seen that happen as well. We've had people, for example, where we've processed their RPSS, submitted a new scheme pays election, and it's been refused. And it's like, oh, why has it been
Mm.
refused? And they say, oh, well, the growth's not big enough. I went, okay, well, show us the latest RPSS, and they show us a different RPSS that's been sent out after the first one that the member never received. So yeah, there is definitely flaws in the sort of communication. Although I would say I do feel for the people who actually work at NHS having spoken to quite a number of them, they genuinely care and they genuinely want to try and help members. But I think they are challenged with the resources they are given to try and undertake such a mammoth task.
Yeah. I will say that whenever we speak to NHSBSA or any of our clients speak to them, they're actually incredibly helpful.
Mm,
The members line is really, they spend a lot of time with people.
yeah.
But as you say, it's just the resources
Mm,
in terms of getting these things done. And for those people who haven't got an RPSS, and we were sort of saying, well, you can always try and call and request one. And we're hearing things like, oh, well, you're next on the list to be processed, or oh, you haven't got one because your records aren't up to date. At least that gives people an indication of why they've not got one
yeah.
or what's happening. But I think there's a lot of anxiety that people know that something's supposed to have come. Should they have had it and it didn't come in the
Yeah.
post? So I think there's a lot of anxiety out there.
Definitely. Definitely.
So it's interesting to see. For those people who maybe have had something, I don't know if you have seen a lot of this. We found there's quite a large cohort of maybe consultants who naturally are employed and so don't think to have an accountant. If they've got small things to claim in the tax return, they can do their own self-assessment. Maybe didn't even know that they were subject to the annual allowance in the first place.
We've
You've seen
seen
this?
people who should have declared thousands and thousands of tax historically, but didn't,
Mm, mm.
because they just genuinely did not know. They assumed I go to work, I'm PAYE, surely they'd take away every tax that I'm meant to be paying, and weren't aware of this.
And for those people, I suppose, have you seen that being a significant amount? Because obviously there's a point in time where some of that tax does have to be paid, but I suppose part of the remedy is anything that's called out of scope, it's in time barred, that they don't have to pay the tax over on that.
Yeah, we have found there's quite a lot that sort of predate the 2019-20 that should have been charged but weren't charged. We were also very aware that a lot of these people didn't get statements originally.
Mm.
So there's one I know of that they had like 80 odd thousand pound tax charges in those early years. And they said, I've never had a statement. Didn't really even
Wow.
know I had to do anything about this.
Yeah.
No, I feel for members. It's ridiculously complex. The whole situation, the pension scheme itself, the tax that sort of is surrounding it, and again, I feel for the pensions agency. I don't think they're fully up to date with the changes in tax. Admittedly, they have been very proactive in making changes. So. I won't go into the details, but we were talking about transitional tax-free amount certificates and how Treasury didn't really understand the interplay between
Mm.
doctors' pensions and sort of sub-awards and everything else like that. But fortunately, the people I was speaking to at NHS Pensions were very sympathetic and very quickly developed a fast-track solution for members in this situation. They've still got a backlog, so
Mm.
members looking at this will think, oh, NHSBSA aren't doing much about it, but they are trying.
Yeah. And I think for members now, part of the issue is planning going forwards. A lot of it is based on what your actual annual pension is and what your records show to date. And of course, if there's a gap, what we're finding now is when there's a gap in the record, PCSE won't process any further certificates because the gap. And I suppose I understand the logic is that maybe they identify the gap, the individual then say, oh, there's a gap and plug it.
Yeah.
Whereas if they just leave it, the issue compounds. But of course, what's then happening is if that gap doesn't get plugged for whatever reason, let's say PCSE can't process the certificate or they just don't, or there might be different reasons, then of course the issue gets worse and worse. And we've seen members with sort of 5-6 years worth of contributions that haven't been deducted. And that's just ignoring annual allowance, just basic tax. That's a lot of tax relief that they haven't had on those deductions that have been paid over.
It can also cause problems for people who are actually getting to retirement and wanting to make decisions and then realising, my pension's not up to date, I can't take it yet.
Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
a sorry situation.
So we've talked a bit about McCloud. There's obviously another part to McCloud that we know about, which is really interesting, called Contingent Decisions.
Yeah. So we kind of have just started getting into this. So one of the other things that came out of the McCloud Remedy is that if you would have made a different choice had you had access to the legacy, the old 9508 scheme, you now have an opportunity to sort of revisit those choices that you made. So some might be about things that you might have cancelled. So, for example, if you cancelled an added years contract or an added pension contract, then you could ask them to revisit that and look to have that reinstated. But one of the biggies is reinstating service, particularly for those people who did that hokey cokey. They left the scheme and then rejoined later on, trying to control that pension growth. Members who are subject to the McCloud discrimination can now reinstate some or all of the membership between April 2015 and April 2022. So it's a good chance for people to actually reflect on the choices that they made and think with a fresh pair of eyes, did I make the right decision? Because a lot of the time, in hindsight, we probably didn't. We saw lots of people sort of opting out purely for tax without realizing that the benefits would actually significantly outweigh the tax. So having this second opportunity is definitely a good thing. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as it first appears, which you thought it would be. But there are all sorts of issues such as, well, NHS pensions, they don't know your tax situation. So we had one of our pilot cases whereby when you look at the illustration, it showed that their member was going to get extra pension, extra lump sum, and it looked like that the extra cost would quickly be recovered with all those extra pension benefits. The trouble is, it then retrospectively creates this annual allowance taper issue, and the resultant tax charge and then deduction from their pension from scheme pays meant that they would have been paying money to reduce their own pension.
Wow.
Which again is absurd. Similarly, we had cases the other way around, whereby it looks like on the illustration, it would take years for them to get their money back. So they're thinking, well, I might start benefiting from my late 70s. Why should I bother? But when we did the analysis and sort of tied together all of their old officer membership, the lump sum alone was nearly £28,000 more than the cost to reinstate. So it would be free pension that they would have been walking away from. So it's a great opportunity for people to revisit decisions that they've made in the past. But be warned, it's not as simple as it first appears.
It feels like everything on pensions goes back to that point about it's having the right information, isn't it? And I think that's obviously where Medifintech come in. That you do a lot of this modelling and taking the illustration and then looking at actually what it actually means for people in real terms. And I think that's what people really struggle with.
Oh, absolutely. And this type of decision isn't one that should be done in isolation. And again, not even in isolation with someone like Medifintech, because what we encourage people to do is to look at this, then also engage with their accountant and also their financial advisor, because these are important tax and financial planning decisions that they're making. Which is also why I kind of understand that NHS can't provide all of the answers to this. This is a situation that wasn't their making. It was a government policy, and trying to fix it involves lots of different agencies, not just the one.
So for those people who did opt out, they're in potentially quite a good position now because they could select exactly what they want to put back in over what period of time.
Oh, absolutely. We have one client, for example, that opted out in March 2016. And if they did nothing, their pension would be about 60,000. If they reinstated everything, the pension comes in at about £64,000, but they would have spent £124,000 doing so. We know the scheme inside out. We look at different patterns. We've found 2 different patterns where they can actually spend a lot less money and get significantly more pension, which again is a bit absurd that you can have the benefit of hindsight to try and play with the numbers.
Yeah.
GPs is another classic example. If you were a GP that opted out for the whole of the remedy period. There's this rule whereby if you go back within 5 years, then you get this enhancement to the revaluation, an extra 1.5% per year. And if you go back within 5 years, it gets backdated to the date that you left. So technically, as a GP, you could put 1 month's worth of membership in, say, 2020, 1 month's worth of membership maybe a little bit later, and go back in now, and for like 3 months worth of pension contributions,
Have all the
you've got all of those years of extra 1.5%.
And of course, in the 1920, you've got the
You've got the
the
compensation scheme.
compensation, and obviously the government backed compensation for any annual allowance charge in that year would be made good into your pension. So
Absolutely.
it's a bit of a game change. And actually, we've seen a lot of clients who maybe have come to us in recent years and were advised previously to opt out and were never told about the 5-year rule.
Yes.
And it's very difficult when you pick up a client who's been out for 10 years and you say, oh, you've been out for 10 years. And they said, well, I didn't know about that. There's nothing you can really do. But of course, now
you can go back.
there's an opportunity.
But we also understand that this is a very complex task for members. We argued this with NHS BSA. It's like, well, how can you expect members to sort of come to the decision with these sort of complex choices? And we discussed whether or not members would be able to be compensated for the financial detriment that getting this analysis done would cost. And fortunately, every single one of our pilot cases that we've done, our costs have been recovered by the client from NHS BSA under the cost claim back scheme. So that is one sort of little ray of hope for these types of members. So we're here to help, and there's potential that your costs could be covered through the scheme.
So what are the initial steps that someone would take if they're interested in this? Say someone's listening to this and they say, oh, actually that was me. I opted out and I'm really curious as to what it would look like. What's the next step?
Well, the first thing I would urge all people who actually opted out at all during that remedy period from the 1st of April 2015 to the 1st of April 2022, well, check your service extract, that document we talked about earlier, because that will show you where the gaps are. But then get the quote. The quote itself is no charge from NHS BSA. You have a deadline of 12 months from when you get that quote to either take any action. If you want to, you can actually cancel that quote and get another one as well. So let's say, for example, you get one quote that says, I'm going to reinstate 6 years, and you think, actually, that's too expensive for me. I want a quote for 4 years. You can do that, and then you've got 12 months from the new quote. I'd also point out there's no deadline at the moment at all to get a quote. So you could potentially, if there are financial issues, you might want to wait until you're very close to retirement, because one of the ways of paying for these reinstatements is you can use your pension benefits to pay for it. So if we think back to that example where the lump sum was more than the cost to reinstate, well, that type of person might want to do a quote 6 months before they retire, enact the quote, and therefore get the extra pension. But it's a hugely complex area. But I would urge everybody just to get that understanding in the first instance. And then if you need support to go through it, particularly if you're a complex case, and by complex, I would say consultants, GPs, dentists, those types, because there will be something in there that you won't know about. And there could be an adverse interaction with your pension record, but there could be a very positive interaction that you're not aware of either.
That's really interesting. On the pension review report, just out of curiosity, how many times do you find an error in the pension records? Not putting you on the spot. But
I remember once we did some analysis on this because we were asked by the press, and we found something like 1 in 8 cases we were finding errors. Now, admittedly, not every case is like, look, we've just found somebody who's missed out on like £500,000 worth of value as a result of all of this. We have had a case like that, though. But we do find sort of small errors, like, well, this person, well, you've actually been overcharged £1,000 because they've done this and because they've done that. But we do find a lot of errors.
I asked the question just because I think it illustrates how complicated this is. And I think, as you say, there's something that you won't have thought of or something you won't have known about. I think that's really the reason to use a specialist. And I can't think of anyone who knows the NHS pension better than you, Graham. So I think it is really important for people to understand that there is help out there. It's just about locating that help and making sure you've got access to it and not being afraid to ask.
Yes.
So I think a lot of people find it just overwhelming and think, oh, well, I've got this quote. I don't know how many years that I want to buy back in. Oh, I'll just worry about it later.
Hmm.
But actually, it's a good starting point, as you say, just to ask for help and
Yeah.
someone to tell you, what to do, and then look at the numbers and think of the things that maybe they haven't
Yeah.
thought about as well. So any lasting advice, Graham, in terms of what you could say to our audience today, apart from get their service extracts? Because I think that is probably one of the most important things you could
It is.
do.
I would urge everybody just to sort of check their pension record. It's the one thing that we come across all the time where things are wrong, and people retire with the wrong benefits, and they're missing
Mm,
out on money that they've worked hard for. They really have. And we know that the system is wrong. We know that the tax policy isn't the best to try and sort of encourage healthcare workers to keep on working. But don't miss out on those benefits. If you've opted out at all, please look at reinstating. If you're worried about tax, don't just opt out as a knee-jerk reaction to this. Get support, and it can be from us, it can be from accountants. There is a whole industry now set up to support healthcare workers.
mm, And I think that's a really good note to end on, is making sure that people ask for help and reach out. So thank you so much for your time today. I mean, we could talk for hours about this, and I'm sure we will again. But thank you so much for joining me today. It was really,
Thanks
really
for having me
interesting.
on.
And to our audience out there, thank you for listening. If you do have any NHS pension questions, feel free to contact me, or of course Graham at Medifintech, and we're here to help. But for now, thank you for listening.